Hi everyone, Mr. Davis here. Welcome to another one of our PE lessons on remote learning. And this one is all about commercialization. So it links into the topic we've just done to do with media. And before we get onto that, a few knowledge recall questions covering a range of different topics from paper 2. So if you just work your way through each of these 8 questions, make sure you've got an answer written down. Pause the video here to do that, and then we'll pick it up again shortly. So one at a time, let's just go through these 3 types of media. So you could have had anything from TV, radio, newspapers, internet. There are 1 or 2 others like magazines and CD-ROMs and things like that, but those are the main ones. Second stage of information processing. So you've got input, decision-making, output, and feedback. So the key one here then is decision-making. One reason for hooliganism. It's got various different reasons for that rowdy and violent behavior in sport. Anything from rivalry, alcohol, frustration, masculinity. So that's men just kind of throwing their weight around, being rowdy men, hype and gang culture. If you're not sure about that topic, then it's worth looking back at that and not just the reasons, but the strategies used to combat hooliganism. Personality type suit to team games. So you've got introverts and extroverts. It's the extroverts that are suited to the team games. They like the bubbly, social liveliness of a high arousal team sport. Lots of social interaction, and introverts are just the opposite of that. One example of a mineral required in a healthy, balanced diet, and the go-to answer there is something like calcium, which you can get in milk. It's good for healthy bones. One somatotype, or the somatotype best suited to long-distance running. So you've got mesomorph, endomorph, and this one is your ectomorphs. So good to think of features of those ectomorphs and reasons why they'd be well suited to that sort of event. Definition of motivation. So everyone is probably aware of what motivation is, but you need a definition for it. It might sound complicated, but it's actually quite a short one. Essentially, it's the drive to succeed. It's the easiest way to think of what motivation is. And finally, one example of visual guidance. And you could have had anything from demonstrations, photos, videos, anything like that, anything that you can see. Okay, so today's topic is essentially to do with, it's all based around sponsorship. Sponsorship, the links to the media, process of commercialization, all of these terms that we will look at throughout the course of the session. So sponsorship is your title. Make sure that's neatly written at the top of the page. I will learn what sponsorship is and how it impacts on sport. And then some keywords. Please note these down along with the definition so you're clear on what each one is as we work through the lesson. So commercialization sounds really fancy and complicated, but essentially it's the process of bringing a new product onto the market. It's that process of involving and driving money through sport. If you think back, 50 years and the limited money that was involved in sport, particularly things like football, comparatively to what it is now, it's chalk and cheese. It's changed enormously. The media, which is what we looked at last week, and we've already just touched on what the different types of media are. But the media as a definition is just the ways that people communicate. And if you think about those different types of media, TV, newspapers, radio, internet, it's essentially what it is. It's just methods of communication. And finally, sponsorship. So sponsorship is where a company pays money to a team or a performer in return for advertising their goods. So a product is going one way and money is going the other way. So just pause the video, make sure you've got all of those down before we move on. Okay, so before we get into the nitty-gritty of it all, let's just have a think about different types of different things in sport, I should say, which are used to advertise goods. So if you think of all the different elements within sport, what makes up sport? How can they be used to advertise goods? So what sort of things are we talking about? For example, you've got the players and the performers. So they obviously play a significant role in the whole process of sponsorship and commercialization and the advertisement of goods. So on this one, it's Raheem Sterling. If you can think of any more, then just pause the video here and note a few more down. Famous sports performers who've advertised goods. So have a think, whether it's clothing, whether it's footwear, whether it's products that really might have very little to do with the sporting performance, but it just might be a product that they promote. So I think things like watches and jewelry and things like that. So have a think about that and make a note of a few more if you can think of them. So as well as the actual performers, you've got the teams and the clubs. So they are obviously a significant advertisement board, if you like, for sponsorship and businesses to promote their products. So you can see a few there, clubs that are sponsored by Adidas, Nike, Puma, etc. Can you think of any other clubs or teams that have got sponsorship? Again, just pause the video and make a note of any that you can remember. It's just good to flush out all of those ideas. The next one are the things like the actual grounds and the facilities. So on this one, it shows the Arsenal Emirates Stadium. Can you think of other facilities and stadium that have actually been directly used for advertisement and sponsorship? Again, pause the video, add any that you can think of. And finally, you've got the actual events. So the sporting events themselves. So you've got the players playing in the teams playing at the stadiums, and the clubs overall making up the actual events or the competitions. So this one is the Barclays Premier League. It's not just the Premier League, it's the Barclays Premier League. So that name is associated with the actual event. Finally on this, just pause the video. Can you think of any others? Whether it's football, whether it's rugby, whether it's basketball, most high profile sporting competitions are directly associated with some sort of sponsorship. See if you can make a note of a few more, and then we will move on. Okay, so this is the tricky part of this whole process. There's not often any kind of in-depth questions about this, but it's something that you just need to be aware of. It's much more straightforward than it can sometimes appear. It's something known as the golden triangle. And the golden triangle is that essentially it's about money and the financial relationship between three key groups. The sport, which could be the clubs, or it could be performers, or it could even be spectators. So the sport as a whole is one group. Then you've got the media and all the things that make up the media. And then finally, you've got the actual sponsors and the businesses. So if you want to add those into your diagram, now just to be clear, so sponsorship, you've also got businesses. So as you make a note of this diagram, just add in next to sponsors, you've got things like essentially businesses that create the products. And alongside sport, excuse me, just make a list of the things that it could involve. So players, clubs, and potentially spectators, so the sport as a whole. Okay, now once you're getting going with putting this diagram down on paper, you've actually got to be able to explain what it all means. So essentially, it's all three of these things are intrinsically linked, which means they can't really function effectively without the other two. It can't just be that one is linked to the other one. It has to be a kind of a three-way process here. And I've put these two words at the top, product and promotion, because they're crucial terms when explaining how this golden triangle works. So before we get into any of the details, just have a think in terms of links between two of the three. So try and just make basic links between them, and then you'll see how the overall process works. So for example, how does the media use sport? How are they linked together? So if you think of the most obvious type of media would be the television. What's the link between the television and the sport? You might think that sounds obvious. And each link individually isn't complicated. It's just putting it all together and understanding how the kind of a three-way process works. So can you think of any links there? What does the sport get out of that link? What does the media get out of that link? Do the same thing for sport and sponsorship. So what benefit does the sport have of being linked with businesses and sponsors? And then vice versa, what's the benefit to the sponsors of being linked into the sport? So whether that's the teams or the players or even the spectators. And then finally, the links between the media and sponsorship. So what's the key link there? Why does the media need sponsorship, and how does the sponsorship rely on the media? So pause the video. This is not easy, but take a few minutes just to try and think it through. What are the different links between each of these three things? And what are the benefits to each part of the group, like each part of the diagram to the other one? What are they getting out of it if it's successful? So pause the video, have a think, and then we'll go through it. Okay, so I'm going to start here. There isn't a particular, because it's a kind of cyclical thing where one thing leads to another thing and another thing and another thing, and it goes round and round. There's not a particular place where you start with this. So I've just thrown my hat on this bit. So the media, what they're getting is they're getting the sport. So for instance, with Sky Sports being shown on the television, they get the Premier League. They pay for the rights to show Premier League football. That's what they're getting. And in return, the Premier League is getting a huge amount of money from Sky Sports. Literally, the deal now is we're talking billions. I think it was something like just over £5 billion, the latest deal that Sky Sports negotiated with the Premier League. That money goes to the Premier League, and then it's splintered off to the different clubs in the Premier League. That's why there's such a desperation to be in the Premier League. That's why the final of the league below, the playoff final for the Championship, is regarded as the biggest game financially in sport, because the clubs that win stand to make such a huge amount of money relative to the earnings that they would have had playing Championship football. So huge amounts of money involved in being involved in the Premier League. That's just one example. The media, for example, show and promote the sport, and in return, the sport gets a load of money for it. So just nice, simple links. From this side, the sponsor gets the sport. So the sponsor gets to use, whether it's the club or the player, they get to use them as their kind of base for advertising their products. The sport, so again, the player or the team, gets money in return. So the sponsors, the businesses have the money, and they would pay the player or the team to be their kind of advertising board. So whether that's from the last example, Raheem Sterling and his adverts for Gillette, so they're paying him to use that product, and then in return, Raheem Sterling is getting a huge amount of money for being associated with that product. It can be linked to individual players, or it could be teams. So for instance, the sponsorship deals that each individual football team would strike with the different groups, and then they would have the sponsor's name on their shirt, and the sponsor will obviously get a lot of money from selling those shirts as long as the club is successful. So that's the link there. Again, it's very much focused about money and the product and the promotion of that product. Then the final bit is to do with the media and the sponsorship. So the sponsors want to be able to promote their product through the media. So getting it out there on a kind of global level, the advertisements, like the ad breaks at halftime or at breaks in play in other sports, it's during that time that the sponsors want to promote their product, and they pay a huge amount of money to the media to be able to do that. Now that's only worth doing if people are watching and engaged in the event. So the event's got a high level of spectators. Now they're only going to get the spectators if the sport is high profile. So that's why football has exploded in terms of money over the last few years, because this works perfectly for football, for men's football. So there's a huge amount of money coming from the businesses, and that's going into the media. The media are then using that to gain the sport sport are benefiting from all of that money to improve facilities and training and player contracts, and the overall quality of the performance is going up, which then makes it even more of a kind of enticing and engaging sport to watch. And then from that, the sponsors will then want to link in with the clubs and the performers directly. So there's a kind of a three-way process here in terms of going around the triangle. It's complicated when you think of it as a whole thing. But if you just break it down into these separate links, and I've tried to make it as concise as possible, what I want you to do before we move on is just add in some of those examples. So if you can add in at least a couple of examples each way. So thinking of how the media is linked into the sport. I gave you one example about football. Can you think of any others? On the other side, the sorts of sponsorship that goes from businesses and organizations directly to teams and players, and the money that's transacted there. And then at the bottom, just in terms of adverts, what sort of adverts do you see on TV for what kind of products, what channels and that sort of thing. So anything from that. It's not, like I said, it's not often a large question comes up on this, but you've just got to be clear on what the different, the key groups are and the benefit to each one of the other's involvement. Without one of these, this whole process doesn't work. So it's no good. The sponsors aren't going to sponsor football players if the football players aren't being shown on TV. Equally, the media aren't going to buy football like the Premiership if the Premiership isn't a high profile event, because people aren't going to watch it. So they're not going to pay a lot of money if people aren't going to watch it. So the whole thing links in together. It is a little tricky, but if you just try and break it down into these simple three key areas with a few examples, hopefully that should do you well. Okay, ready to move on? So the next part of it just focuses very much on sponsorship, which is a crucial part of this whole process. It links into media, as you will see, but we're just going to concentrate more on the sponsorship element of it now. So generally speaking, people associate sponsorship directly with money. It's not always like that, and there are potentially questions in the exam which ask you for different examples of sponsorship. And it sounds complicated, but it's actually more straightforward. So what are different ways that players and teams can be rewarded, if you like, through their links to these companies? So we've got money, but we've also got things like equipment for training. So if clubs have that, that's obviously a significant benefit to them. So they're getting a benefit from it. It might just be, rather than giving them the money, they're actually given loads of free equipment. If they've got a deal with some sort of sports equipment company, rather than paying them and then the club having all the money to go and buy the equipment, they just give them the equipment directly. So Man United don't have to go out looking for footballs. They will just get them from their links with Nike, for example. So can you think of other ways that sponsorship might be involved in sport? How else might clubs and individuals receive sponsorship? So it might be through clothing, kit, essentially like training kit. So again, players aren't expected just to come with their own kit. They will have their own kit that's done through the sponsorship of the club. Footwear is another one. So things, whether in the same way, but you can get a separate mark for it. You know, whether it's clubs or individuals, they will have their own deals, their sponsorship deals with sports footwear companies, and they will get them directly. So Ronaldo doesn't have to go out and buy his football boots. Lionel Messi doesn't have to go to the shops or order it online. He gets it as part of his deal. And finally, it might just be through a provision of other things like facilities, training equipment, that sort of thing. It could even be things like coaching and specialist individuals that could help support the club. That might be something that sponsors provide rather than just here's a load of money. So if you just make a note of each of these things, these are types of sponsorship. So yeah, you've got money, but you've also got equipment, you've got clothing, you've got footwear, you've got facilities, and you've also got things like coaching, and I mean, it could be to pay for things like physios and stuff like that as well, but it's probably easier just to stick with these ones. So make a list of these before we move on. Okay, now this is the major task that's left, and it focuses around, excuse me, commercialization. And again, commercialization sounds complicated, but we're just talking about the involvement of money in sport. So there's 5 different key groups that we've got to be thinking about here. For each of the groups, I want you to make a list of the positive and negative impacts of commercialization in sport. So what are the positives to the performers of this involvement of sponsorship and the media and the overall idea of commercialization and this drive of money into sport? What's the benefits to the performers, and what are the potential negatives or the potential downsides? Yeah, it's great if they're getting big contracts and getting given loads of equipment and like all the fame and the glory that goes with it, but what are the downsides? You've got to do that for the performers, the sport as a whole. So whether it's the particular events or the major competitions, but just think more broadly about, rather than just teams and individuals, the sport as a whole. Also the officials. So how have they been impacted? Some ways it can be positive, but it can also be a negative element to it there. Spectators, so the fans, how has it influenced and affected them? And finally, the sponsors themselves. So what's been the impact, potential benefits of their involvement in sport, and the potential downsides. Okay, pause the video here. This is going to take you a fair bit of time to complete, because there's you should be looking at least 3 or 4 things for each of the groups, positives and negatives. So maybe 3 positives for performers, 3 negatives for performers, and then you do the same thing for each of them. So pause the video here whilst you get on with that. Okay, so I'm just going to go through these fairly quickly now, and you can add anything in that you haven't been able to get once you've been working through it. So in terms of the performers, positives, as I said before, this is all entirely focused around money. So the increased income to the performers, having these sponsors and these businesses involved provides a huge injection of money and financing to sport, and the performers are often the primary benefits, the primary beneficiaries of that income. So increased income, they get more money. That's why the players can earn hundreds of thousands of pounds a week. Essentially, it's because the money comes from these sponsors and the involvement of the media and the whole globalization of the sport. They are the key beneficiaries. There's also improved training that they're then able to get, because they're high profile people that the companies want to look after. They're going to look after every aspect of their life. They're going to make sure that they're not wanting for anything. So the training is improved. Once the training improves, their fitness and overall performance will improve. They'll feel better. So it's the comfort of having that sort of arrangement, the confidence that comes with being successful and high profile and getting all of those things given to you. That's going to give you a huge sense of confidence. And finally, just the reduced stress. So that may be at a slightly lower level, but performers who are starting to earn more money are going to have less worries in life. They're not going to be worried about bills and how to pay for their mortgage and how to pay for their cars and things because of the injection of money. It's not in any way across all sports, but high profile sportsmen and women will benefit massively from that. The negatives, so potentially, because of their high profile standing, a lack of privacy, a lack of free time, advertising commitments. So they might be kind of corporate involvement and conditions. They have to go and meet certain kind of corporate partners. They have to spend time doing media interviews and doing the kind of high profile, boring side of the job that only comes when you're a successful athlete. So if the company is paying you, then you have to do what they ask you to do. If that means getting up in the morning to do an interview or talking to people on like outside of the game, that's what you've got to do because they're paying your bills. The commitment to the product, so that side of things means, you know, if you're a footballer and you strike a deal with Reebok, and you don't really want to wear Reebok boots, but they're giving you a lot of money, so you have to. That's not necessarily ideal for you. If you know that you play better in Nike, but you've got to go with Adidas, well, that's unfortunate, but you have to do it. So it was famously Rory McIlroy, a golfer, used to play with just his old set of golf clubs that he grew up with, struck a huge deal with Nike to kind of take over as Nike's kind of global ambassador for sport from Tiger Woods. But he was rubbish after that. He's hardly won anything. I mean, he's successful, but he looked like he was going to win every tournament. And then he changed his golf clubs and he really struggled, but he had to stick with them. And there would be examples of other people having to do the same thing. The product might not be aligned to the performer's values. What that means is some high profile products like alcohol companies and things like that, they don't necessarily fit in with the values of high profile athletes. But if they're being paid by them, then that, you know, that sponsorship link means that they have to promote them, even though it's not in tune with what they actually think is right. And then there's obviously an increased pressure to perform. So they're giving you all the money. It's not like you can just play badly and still just take it. You'll just get dropped, and your profile will go down, and you'll lose all of that success that you've built up. So there's a continual pressure to perform. Yes, it's great that it kind of eases the burden short term, but if you're going to maintain those kind of contracts, then you've got to play well. So just fill that out with some of the detail that we talked about there. Make sure you've got a clear list, benefits and potential negatives of commercialization to the performer. Get the idea of how this works now. So let's just rattle through the rest. So the sport as a whole, again, money coming in, a range of competitions. So rather than just one standard competition, for instance, with cricket, used to be just 5-day test matches of cricket. Now they've got 1-day matches. They've got shorter competitions. They've got the 2020. It's much more kind of exciting, but it has meant that there's a move away from the traditions. But essentially, increased range of competitions. That's good for the sport because it's going to increase the profile and increase the kind of interest in the sport. And so there's going to be more high-profile events. And if there's more high-profile events, it's just going to bring even more money into the sport as a whole. Potential negatives. So often the commercialization element and the sponsorship focuses on a limited range, i.e. men's football. So that still dominates. There is money trickling down into other areas. And as soon as those sports start to become more involved in terms of their presence on like high profile media platforms like television and Sky, like women's football is starting to take off because it's on TV a lot more and they're getting more money as a result. Some sports that aren't necessarily benefiting from that would be the lower profile sports that aren't shown on telly. And because they're not shown on TV, they're just not going to get the money. So that income isn't spread evenly across different sports. It's very much focused on football and largely men's football still. Their involvement in the sport means that they've got far more control over like key aspects of the game, like kickoff times. So it used to be that all football kicked off at 3 o'clock on a Saturday. Now, relatively, there's far less. There's all the high-profile games are pushed onto kind of prime slots on a Sunday or even Monday night. And that's very, very different from what it used to be and takes away the tradition of the sport a little bit. It's not ideal for the fans. It might not be that the clubs and the sport actually wants them then, but the sponsors control it. And finally, the sponsor might reflect poorly on the sport and the team. So what I mean by that is, for instance, if the kit was essentially like an unpopular, ugly kit, then that kit wouldn't sell, and it might reflect badly on the club that the club have just got. They've got this ugly kit, when before really liked the old kit with the old sponsors, and now they've got this new kit with the new sponsors. Often that's what happens, and there's a constant kind of changing of kit in football, which isn't very popular, reflects badly on the clubs when they're constantly changing kit, and obviously they do it to earn money, but it doesn't go down well within the sport. The third one, official. So lots of these will be similar to the performers. So the income is increased, the opportunity to be more professional, so professional referees. So that's their dedicated job, which is a huge benefit to them. They're getting paid a lot of money now for their role, and so rather than simply being part-time and having to take on other jobs, it's just purely professionals. And with that, the level of performance and fitness will improve, so they're going to get better at their job. Opportunity to travel around the world and take part, be involved in high-profile events like refereeing Champions League finals and European competitions. And with that, high-profile, like top referees are now, for the good or bad of it, they are in some cases sharing that level of publicity and that fame with the players themselves. It shouldn't be like that, really, but high profile, lots of, like, if you like football, you'll probably know a few referees. You'll recognize referees and know what they look like. And that could be a good thing, but potentially it could also bring some downsides as well. So if they're having a good day, then that's great. But if they've had a bad day, that brings a lot of negative pressure on them. So negatives: lack of privacy, just like with the players. So a lot of media and cameras in their face and tracking where they live and talking to their family and friends, and that's not good. Front pages of newspapers for negative reasons. Increased pressure on them to perform. Now it's being shown, now it's such a high profile thing and they're getting paid a lot of money. That's a huge amount of pressure on referees to make those key decisions. You're always going to upset someone, even if your decision making is accurate. So there's always going to be some kind of negative publicity, particularly if you've got something wrong, if it's been proven afterwards that a referee made the wrong decision. That's not a good thing for them, and potentially could lead to a kind of demotion. So in the same way as it's good if they're getting promoted, it's a bad thing potentially if they're going to get demoted. They might not be able to referee in the Premier League anymore if they've had a bad day at the office and they've made some bad decisions. They obviously haven't meant to, but they could lose all of that kind of high profile fame and money if they then get demoted down to a lower league. So even if they haven't done anything wrong, even if it's just a controversial decision, potentially that means they get taken out of the next week's games and then maybe not awarded a place within the Premier League set up the following season. Spectators, so in the improved quality and the overall, so the improved quality of the sport and the offer that's being presented to them. So what I mean by that is, so the improved quality of the actual game. So they're watching a better game because the players are at a higher level, the clubs are more high profile, it's more razzmatazz. It just improves the overall experience for players. You're not watching a game of a poor performance, it's elite level sport, which is highly entertaining. So it improves the quality of the sport on offer, but it also, the commercialization aspect also improves the range of sports that are on offer. So there's more games, more competitions, even during like the post-season. So when they should be kind of resting, they're going off on tours and you get to watch the matches in kind of European cities and stuff, and new competitions are getting talked about all the time. And that's purely because of commercialization and the focus of money driving these new competitions. Improve facilities so that when they go to the grounds, it's a better experience for them there. They're going to benefit from all of that. Increased interactive involvement. So whether it's at the ground or even at home, you get to see the replays, the statistics, the interviews, the player cam. You've got like the red button which you can press to get all different views on the TV. And that just improves the overall experience for the spectators. None of that would happen without commercialization and money driving that sort of thing in the sport. And finally, for the benefits, the dedicated sports channels, the magazines, the websites, it just allows you to, again, kind of improve your experience and involvement with the sport. All hugely beneficial and all directly to do with commercialization. On the downside, you've got things like the cost. So it's now very expensive. If you want that nice comfy seat at Arsenal, you've got to pay £120 for your ticket. And you might have just been happy with a little plastic one that cost you £20. but now everything's gone up in price, whether that's at home, whether that's going to the stadium or just at home. You used to be able to pay, I don't know, 20 quid for Sky Sports, and now it's, you know, £70, and you still don't get all the games because they've gone on to BT, and then you've got to spend more money on BT just to watch the games. So all the cost of it, you know, they have to rake in the money somehow, and that's how they do it. And they make a lot of money out of it, but it's potentially to the negative of the spectators. And then the other major negative is the loss of the kind of the traditions and the integrity. So there's some people, you know, probably more older supporters, but they like the old traditional way. They don't like the way the new go. It's not as good as it used to be. You know, the dive in and the high profile, the players just care about the money, all that sort of thing. That's negative to the spectators because the sport has changed as a result of all the money. So just make a list of all of them. And then finally, you've got the sponsors. So they get the publicity, they get the improved status if that product is linked to a successful performance. So if the team are doing well, then people will associate that with the product, and then the product starts to do well as well. So if the sponsors have sponsored Liverpool and Liverpool win the league, then people are going to think, oh yeah, that company's great because they're aligned with Liverpool, and Liverpool are great, and I love Liverpool because they're winning. So it's directly linked in. It's unlikely you're going to not like the sponsor if the sponsor are linked to your favorite football team. Increased sales, increased income, pretty straightforward. They're going to get a huge amount of money through shirt sales, and that's going to, you know, that's going to improve the overall standing of the company or the business. But there are negatives. So it works the other way. If the team or the athlete is not being successful, that's going to create a negative link to the business. So for instance, if Nike have sponsored Rory McIlroy and he was doing well, but then he starts using their clubs and he starts to have a really bad time, no one's going to want to buy those clubs because they're going to think they're rubbish. You know, if they don't work for Rory McIlroy, then they're not going to work for me. It's the same thing with football boots. If you've got a player who plays really well one season with a set of football boots, and then he changes his group and they go to something else and then plays really badly, no one's going to buy those football boots. So for all the sales and all the income is going to dry up. And finally, kind of the popularity and then the sales are going to be affected by also like just other negative issues, not necessarily just performance level, but just things like crowd trouble, cheating, drug taking, kind of the extras involved in sport. If a sponsor has sponsored an event and it comes, then if it finishes up with a really negative story about it, that's not going to reflect well on the sponsors. If they're sponsoring a player and then that player is found to be cheating, that's going to create a really negative image for the player, but also for the sponsor, the business that's linked with that player. So it's important that you think, yeah, it brings all these benefits, but only if it's really a successful club or a successful individual. Otherwise, it's going to have a negative impact on the sponsors. So important that you've got all of those notes down. There's going to be some exam questions on this, but I'm going to save that for next week. So hopefully you've got a good understanding of what the golden triangle is, what the different types of sponsorship are, the different ways that people can be sponsored, and then obviously looking at the individual, the sport as a whole, the officials, the spectators and the sponsors, the positives and the negatives of commercialization in sport. Right, guys, take it easy and bye-bye.